Well, good afternoon. I'm Mark Mallinger, the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence and Emeritus Professor of Applied Behavioral Science. When we opened the Drescher campus in 2003, I was the Director and then the Associate Dean for full-time programs up until 2010 when I stepped down. My contributions to the university and the Graziadio School go back many years. Today, I have the pleasure of being in the role of moderator and introducing our speaker, Lauren Antonoff. Last year, Lauren was promoted to president of GoDaddy's U.S. Business for Independent Ventures division. She leads GoDaddy's effort to empower everyday through software and services, including GoDaddy websites and marketing. Prior to joining GoDaddy in 2015, Lauren spent 19 years at Microsoft. Her last role was director of program management for SharePoint. Her leadership was instrumental in building one of the most successful products and businesses at Microsoft. Previous projects included Office 2007 and both Mac and Windows versions of Outlook Express. While at Microsoft, she founded the Step Up program designed to increase the number of women in senior management roles. Interestingly, her academic background was not related to tech. While at UC Berkeley, she was involved in, again, rhetoric and political science, a story that she will share with you at the outset of her talk. Lauren is married, lives in the Berkeley Hills in Northern California, has two children, one, a daughter, who is a biology major at Cal State San Luis Obispo, and a teenage son who is a math whiz. And finally, Lauren happens to be my daughter. So let's welcome Lauren Antonoff, our executive speaker for this afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Mallinger and Papa. Despite growing up with a business professor as a father, I actually had no interest in business. Like, I didn't even know what my dad did growing up. In fact, I was really confident that I knew what I was going to do and I was going to be a lawyer. I was wrong. I got involved with the tech industry as an accident. You know, as Mark mentioned, I was in college studying rhetoric and political science, you know, on my way to become a lawyer. And I got involved with a club for Mac enthusiasts, Macintosh computer enthusiasts. And we were here in the Bay Area, so it actually had a bunch of professionals in it. It wasn't college students so much as people in the Macintosh industry. There were people who created software. There were people in the Mac press. There were people from Apple. And, you know, I didn't really know a lot, but I was really curious and I asked a lot of questions, and I learned more and more about how things worked. And because of my liberal arts background, I could then explain the things that I was learning to other people. And colleagues of mine in the group started to see that as an asset, and they would bring me into writing articles for the newsletter, or, you know, participating in answering our helpline and things like that. And eventually someone in the group said, you know, hey, we're publishing this new piece of software. Could you write the documentation? And, you know, I'm in college, so anything that made money that was in line with my hobbies was like awesome. So I'm like, sure, I'll write documentation. So writing technical documentation, you know, it sounds really kind of boring. You go through step by step and you write down all the details. And I wanted to be a lawyer, so I was extra detail oriented. I was going to write down exactly what you needed to do in order to use this software. And, you know, many of you who've used software, when you really get into the details of what you need to do, often it's really complicated and annoying. And I would be writing down these details and I would just think this is like, I'm irritated that I have to tell people all the things that they need to go through. So because I had been hired by friends, you know, it's not like I went and applied for a job. I'd been hired by my friends in this club. I would go to them and I would say, you know, I'm writing that documentation for you, but it's complicated. And if you could just change your software in the following 12 ways, then it would be so much easier to explain. And much to my surprise, that often worked. And they would take my feedback and they would go and make improvements, and the documentation would be easier to explain. And then one of these guys who had hired me had this like epiphany, like, hey, maybe it would be better to hire Lauren to design the software so that I don't have to rewrite it when she writes the documentation. And that's how I started designing software. It was very, very much of an accident and very much sort of as a side gig. But one thing led to another, and I ended up at a tiny software company, and that company was bought by Microsoft. So it's like this, here I am on this path to become a lawyer, and all of a sudden I find myself at this giant company, and I had no idea what people did at companies. Like I wasn't even sure I knew what a company was. And so I just figured I'd do what I'd always done. I'll look at problems from a customer point of view, and I'll form an opinion, and I'll get others to come on board and help make things better. And in the early days of Microsoft, it worked exceptionally well. And I would go about saying, fix this and fix that, and people would do it. And eventually, I found myself in a relatively senior leadership role. And while Microsoft was a big company, even in those days, we're talking like 1996, it was a pretty big company, but the Windows division was very much driven by people like me. Somebody had an opinion and they said to other people, you should go do this, and people would go do it. And sometimes we'd argue about it. And I didn't really, it just seemed like a lot of people like me building something bigger, but I didn't have any sort of mental model for how my role fit in as a leader in a bigger system. I was just doing what I thought was useful, and it worked until it didn't. So one day, I was doing my job. Things had been going pretty well. We were working on a complicated, little bit controversial project. And one day, it was the day before Thanksgiving, my boss, called me in at the end of the day into his office, and he said, we're going to reorg. We're going to bring together these two different groups. And I was like, oh, that makes a ton of sense. Like, these two groups together, we can do so much more. And there's been some friction between the groups. And then he said, that guy who leads that other group, I'm going to have him run this new group. I hadn't thought about that. And, so if he's leading the group, then where am I? And my boss really had that question too. So like, what are you going to go do next? And so like, I figured out like, okay, I don't really have a job. I'm not fired. I'm still a Microsoft employee, but I've got to find another group. And, I was devastated. I thought I'd been doing a pretty good job. Things had been working, things had just sort of, one thing had led to another in my career up till then. And I, everything, it seemed like I was good at my job. And all of a sudden I'm effectively unemployed. And, it was scary, and it was humiliating, and I felt pretty bad for myself, and I think all I wanted to do was hide. And so the farthest place in the company from Windows was Office. Like the Windows team and the Office team didn't love to work with each other. They didn't have the same, like what one thought was good, the other thought was bad. And I'm like, okay, I'll go over there because it didn't work out so well in Windows. I'll go to Office. But I sort of imagined that Office was like just a separate version of what I'd experienced in Windows, because I had no experience with different cultures and different organizations. But when I got there, it was completely different. In Windows, it was like each person sort of driving what they thought was the right thing to happen. The best ideas, or sort of a competition ideas, the best ideas would win. Office was different. Our VP, a man named Steven Sinofsky, he publishes a lot on the internet if you want to read what he writes. He had all these opinions about what we were supposed to do and how we were supposed to do it and how we were supposed to work together. And, like all of a sudden somebody's telling me how to do things in a way that I wasn't used to. And I didn't work with him directly in those early years, but I had this very clear picture in my head of who he was just through the way that the organization works. And I think my story was that he was some sort of passive aggressive micromanager. And, I felt like the people who got ahead were the people who just towed the line. They just did what he wanted instead of the people with the good ideas, and I saw myself as I was a good idea person. So I was pretty unhappy, but I had just come from this other disaster, and, and now I'm having this really difficult experience, and I couldn't just sort of find the next place to hide. So I had to figure out like what had gone wrong before I figured out what I wanted to do next. My sense was it probably wasn't here in Office, but I needed to figure things out. So I did something called a 360. So I don't know if any of you have ever done a 360, but the idea is that you get feedback from all sides. So you have feedback from the people above you, you get feedback from your peers, you get feedback from the people who work from you, and you sort of get this holistic picture of how people see you. And it doesn't tell you things that you don't know. At some level, you're in the room, you know what people think, but you don't see it how they would describe it. And so it looks different when you're looking at it from the perspective of those other people.
So Lauren, if I can just jump in with a
Sure.
quick question. Yeah, today 360 is a typical assessment tool that's used. And I'm sure a number of our students have experienced it, but probably some have not. And so 360 certainly makes a lot of sense, but in terms of getting feedback, but one has to be prepared. Because sometimes you're going to hear in the process some comments that may be a bit disruptive. So what's your sort of handy household hints on how one should prepare themselves for a 360?
Yeah. Just a couple of things. I mean, one thing is that, there really are no surprises. In some ways, a 360 is sort of facing all the fears that you have about what people might think of you and what people might say. And then actually, when you look at those things, in my experience, it's always much less dramatic than you feared. And so just going in and knowing that, yeah, it's scary, but it's not like, people are going to point out that you have, 3 heads that you didn't know about. The things that they talk about are themes that you've probably struggled with or known about, and things that you're proud of. And you're going to get to see how other people think of those and how other people value those. And it's really valuable. The other thing I'll say is there's a temptation. You get asked for a 360 who you want the moderator to talk to. So it's not like they have the magic guide of who to pick. And there's some obvious things like your boss and your direct reports. But often it's sort of in the level of peers and other senior leaders where you're the one who's sort of directing them. And it's easy to think, oh, well, Joey likes me, I'll have them talk to Joey or Sally, they're on my side. But those are not where the valuable points of feedback are. I would say take your most frustrating and complicated relationships and put those people on, because that's where you get the real value out of a 360. That's where you get the insights of, like, oh, that's how I look to them. And it's useful. And you can then figure out, what you're going to do with it. A 360 is private, almost always private between you and the moderator. And so your boss isn't seeing it. It's not how you're being evaluated. It's a learning tool, and it's super useful to sort of face the things that you're worried about and to try to understand how people experience you from their direct perspective.
Okay.
So with that in mind, when I got my 360, again, a lot of it was in some ways a relief. Like, they didn't think I was a coconut. They thought I was good at a bunch of things I thought I was good at. But this one question sort of stood out to me. And it was this question about, is Lauren aligned with the senior leadership of the company and the senior leadership of the division and of the company? And, you'll notice when I talked about Windows, the only time I mentioned the senior leadership or my boss was when I was sort of being shown out the door. And in Office, when I talked about Steven Sinofsky, it was like, he was the guy that I was working against in many ways. And so I knew I wasn't aligned. And in a 360, you have to answer the questions yourselves. And so I put I wasn't aligned. And I thought maybe my bosses would have put that too. But in fact, when I looked at the 360, the senior leaders and even my peers said, oh yeah, she's aligned. They gave me sort of very normal scores. They graded me less harshly than I graded myself. But my direct reports, the people who worked for me, said I wasn't aligned. And I thought that was so strange. And then I started to think about these comments that my boss made when he showed me out the door. And I hadn't really, when he had let me go, I just sort of thought he was being a jerk and he was all wrong. And I really wasn't ready to hear what he said. But what he said was that the team actually felt was excited to work for this other leader, that they didn't feel great working for me. And, I knew I was leading them in the right direction. In fact, the reorg was taking them in the same direction that I had been pointing them. And, people liked me well enough. And so I was like, well, I hadn't been ready to think about what it could mean that the team didn't want to work for me. And this insight about the team didn't feel like I was aligned to my leadership as I worked with the coach, was I worked with the person who was facilitating the 360. The aha moment was like the team didn't feel like if we were successful doing the things that we were doing that wasn't aligned with leadership, that they were necessarily going to be recognized and rewarded for that. So they didn't know if I was leading them in the right direction. And I really had never thought about how the team felt as part of my job. Like I thought I was hired to go make the software and go, sort of deliver these things that we were making for the business. And yeah, I was managing a team to do that, but I just, nobody had told me like, this is how you lead, this is how you manage. And so this was like my first big leadership insight after being a leader for a number of years at this point, and being a successful leader for a number of years, is the first like aha moment. And it may seem super obvious, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to miss. But my role as a leader is not just to pursue the business outcome, but it's specifically to lead people to deliver that outcome. So that was like, that was huge in my growth and my development. But now I'm doing this 360. I'm in this new office organization. I'm definitely not feeling aligned to the leader of office. And so I'm in this kind of hard spot. I know that not being aligned leads to no good outcomes. Like I know what happened in my last job, but I can't fix the leader. And I'm pretty sure that I'm right about my opinions. And so the strategy that I come up with is that I'm just not going to talk about it. And my theory is like, if I stop complaining about all the things that are wrong, maybe people won't know that I'm not aligned, and therefore they'll feel more secure, and I won't have the problems that I ran into again. But when I stop complaining, when I force myself to stop complaining, things would still come up where, we got difficult feedback from leadership, or things would come up that I would normally complain about. And I had to find ways to explain that those things might actually serve a purpose. Maybe it's not crazy what Stephen is asking us to do. And sure enough, when I approached those experiences through a new lens, and I was open to looking for ways that they were helpful, I started to see how the ways that office worked and the way that Stephen led really helped to align the thousands of people who worked in office to deliver this incredibly complex piece of software and be able to land on the exact day we predicted 3 years before. And so that was like the beginning of this journey of coming to understand and embrace and ultimately evangelize the office way of doing things. And of course, once I came to understand the culture, my job got easier, got way more fun, and I started to get recognized and rewarded. And so now I realized that the people who I thought before were towing the line, and I sort of looked down on them and thought they were, sort of had less merit than I brought to the org because they were towing the line. The epiphany was that they were the ones who understood the value and the purpose of our culture, and they were working to make sure that we shipped one great product as one great team. So it wasn't that their ideas were better or worse, it's that they were working in line with the strategy and the culture. So that was my second real big career learning, was the power of culture and organizational design to support outcomes. So, I mentioned this thing about the culture helping us ship these giant pieces of software in these 3-year ship cycles. If any of you have been exposed to the software world, you might think that's crazy. Like, why would anybody make a plan for, shipping something that's 3 years out? And, in today's world, it is pretty crazy. That's the way we worked back in the world of box software. But the transformation that has been brought about by the cloud, where you have real-time feedback about your users, you're able to change software every day, you can see the results of those changes, it's completely transformed the way that software works. But as that started happening in office and we started moving to the cloud, what became clear is that the way that our culture worked was really optimized for the old way of working and not so well set up for this more dynamic cloud world. And this was brought into stark relief when we bought this company called Yammer. Yammer was an enterprise social networking application. We paid over $1 billion for it. We brought them into our organization. We're all excited to share the office culture and the office way of doing things. And all the stuff that had come to make a ton of sense to me they looked at how we worked and they said, you guys are crazy. This doesn't make any sense. We need to move fast. We have to optimize for sort of not aligning things, for letting 1,000 flowers bloom, for testing and iterating. And that culture clash was really difficult to work through as a leader. It was a really hard learning experience, but it was invaluable. And while not everything that Yammer did made sense at the scale of Office, that focus that they had on velocity and experimentation and how to translate that into organizational structures and practices, it was really transformational to our team, to Office, and ultimately, I think, to Microsoft, as we adapted from this world that had been optimized for box software to the world that is the cloud. And so that was, I would say, that third big learning in my career, that it's not just that there's a right culture and a right way to organize for success. It's that what is right makes sense in the context of a given strategy and in the context of the environment that you're operating in. And so something that works for one product at one period of time may make no sense in another. And you have to constantly revisit whether the way that you're doing things, whether the culture that you have and the way that you're organized, whether it makes sense for what you have to go do now. So, talk about moving, sort of taking those lessons from one organization to another. Eventually, after like 19 years, I did leave Microsoft and came to GoDaddy as a VP. And actually,
before you move into GoDaddy, which will be very interesting, you talk about culture. And one of the things that I know were very proud of was the work you did at Microsoft in terms of its, relationship. Tech's not known for a lot of women, and you try to change that, not only in hiring, but more importantly, you put together a program that would help women move to senior management positions. Could you before we go to GoDaddy, just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when I was in Office, I was a manager of managers. So I was fairly senior in the org. And at the level that I was at, there were I had very few women peers. I probably had 30 peers, and, one or two at any given time would be a woman. And, when one would come, another would leave. And that stayed that way for many years. And I always thought, when I get hired at the next level up, I'll help to fix that, because I'll hire a lot more women. And eventually I did get promoted, and I ended up hiring a team of 6 awesome men. And I thought, like, if people like me are sort of perpetuating this problem, how is it going to get better? And it's not like HR could have told me to hire different people. I chose the people that I hired. And so I decided to create a program that was designed to really change the behavior that I had exhibited of hiring men. And I had no idea how to do it. I had no idea. But I said, well, we'll just work the problem. We'll take the candidates. Some were actual candidates for the jobs that I had opened. Some were, some I went out and looked for people who would have been candidates. And I said, we're just going to get together as a group and start to look at what got in the way. Why didn't I see them as a candidate? Why didn't I choose them as a candidate? And we turned that into a whole program where, sort of me as a leader working with would-be candidates. And we actually uncovered a lot of aha moments. That's probably another hour-long talk about those aha moments. But through it, actually, a lot of those women came to understand what they could do to show up in a different way and help to position them. And I think more than half the group did end up in senior leadership, did end up getting promoted to that level of leadership that we were targeting. It also made a lot of the other leaders, a lot of my peers at that more senior level, more aware that this was a challenge. And part of the process was having them spend time with, between these would-be candidates and the people 2 levels up who would be hiring managers for those jobs. And, that program was pretty instrumental. Microsoft has come a tremendously long way since then. But I hope that I helped to contribute to that a little bit.
Right. So, Lauren, for our audience, particularly the female portion of the audience, what pearls of wisdom do you have for women in terms of who are interested in tech, how they can present themselves, or ways in which they're more likely to be hired or promoted?
Yeah. So I would say that the first obstacle that we uncovered is that people self-select out. And so, there was this very first exercise that I wanted people to do. I imagined that we were going to face like a lot of difficult feedback and that there was going to be a lot of heavy discussion. So I wanted our first discussions to be light. And so I said that everybody should come and we were just going to do a little mixer where everybody would share a little bit about what their accomplishments and what they had done. And as women started presenting one after another, they would say things like, well, I've never managed, a group of more than 5 people. I've never had to manage out a lot of people. They kept talking about what they hadn't done. And this was shocking to me because I wasn't interested in what they hadn't done. I was interested in the successes that they had. And as a hiring manager, like, of course, there's a ton of experiences you haven't had. If I'm worried about one of those, I'll ask about those. But when my observation as a hiring manager is that, men would come in and they would tell you all the reasons you should hire them, and women would come in and tell you all the reasons you shouldn't hire them. And it turns out when you tell somebody all the reasons that you're not qualified for a job, it's kind of hard not to believe you. And so just helping people become aware of that phenomenon and that it was really actually not only okay, but appropriate to brag about your accomplishments in a job interview, or to put yourself up for a job where you're not sure if you have all the skills. Those things are important. So that was a big aha, is just, if you're interested in a job, even if you think you're not qualified, go in, apply for the job, tell them why you're qualified, and let them tell you why you're not qualified, because they may see you as qualified. And if they see you as not qualified, you can find out why and which things they care about. And it may be very, very different things than the things you were worried about. And that gives you some idea on where to go from there.
Okay, thank you. Now, maybe you transition to what you're doing at GoDaddy.
GoDaddy. So at GoDaddy, I have a very different role. So at Microsoft, I was a product leader, and I came in for a VP product leadership job at GoDaddy. But I came in with a broader portfolio of applications, and I came in as a business leader who had P&L accountability. So that was very different. But what I discovered in my team, and specifically my team in those days, was very focused on how we build websites for small businesses. And the group itself, though, actually had like 5 or 6 different like sub teams. There was a website builder team, an online store team, an SEO team, and each of these teams made separate and unrelated products. And each of these teams was trying to market their separate and unrelated products. And each of these teams was vying for the company's dollars and marketers and real estate on our homepage, and ultimately for the attention of our customers. But they were competing with each other for that attention. One group was effectively saying what you really need is a new website, and another group was saying what you really need is SEO, and another group was really saying what you really need is a store. And so, I used my experience from Office, where it really was about how we all work together on one goal, to realign the group and say, like, actually, we only have one customer, and that customer is the small business, and we only want to sell them one product. And that product is the set of capabilities that they need to reach their potential customers and engage their actual customers and, and sell their business. And so we had to figure out how to bring those things into concert. And that was a way that I was able to rely on the skills that I had, which was good, because at the same time, I had to learn a whole new set of skills. Like, there were words like the ROAS comes to mind. Like, this is one of the first words that I heard. I'm like, I've heard thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of 3-letter acronyms at my time at Microsoft. Microsoft was famous for 3-letter acronyms, but at GoDaddy, they used a whole different vocabulary. I was much closer to marketing and all these terms and jargon that I didn't know about. I didn't know how to think about marketing. So it was a huge leadership. It was a huge growth opportunity for me to learn how to work in this whole new way and learn a whole bunch of new skills to drive a business that's driven by online sales and a call center, very different from the enterprise world that I had come from. And at the same time, I was able to take all the knowledge that I had acquired over my years and actually let me deliver results while I was learning that stuff. And so that's sort of the thing that I came to appreciate, is even as you get more senior and you get more expertise, there's always whole worlds that you don't know about, and those opportunities to grow just keep coming. And last year at GoDaddy, we got a new CEO. His name's Aman Bhutani. He came from Expedia, and he has had a radically different approach to leadership, where our leadership in the past is focused very much on those financial results and financial accountabilities. obviously he cares about those things, but in terms of how he leads, the first thing he did is he brought us in to a learning session with a professor from the Harvard Business School. Sorry, Papa, wasn't Pepperdine, but Harvard's good too. They're okay. And he brought them in, and we did, as a leadership team, we learned these new models around strategy. And I had been exposed to some of the strategy work and some of these concepts at Microsoft, so they weren't wholly new for me. I learned some new things, but the really interesting learning for me was that Aman wasn't just teaching us strategy. He was using that process of learning together as a group as a way to realign us as a team, to give us sort of start to build a common base that would ultimately help us reshape the operating model of the company and build and rebuild our strategy as we went forward. And so that was, I would say this realization that learning isn't just sort of about a personal journey and something you can learn along the way, but learning actually can be a strategy to help lead a business. And that's sort of the learning process that I'm in now. I'm having a great time at doing that. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box, Lauren. I'll read it off. I've met a few women in director positions who said that it was incredibly difficult to be respected within their generation, and that they envy the women under 30 in the workforce now because they have it so much easier. How do you feel about the younger generation's gender outlook compared to what you experienced?
Interesting. It's interesting. I haven't experienced it quite that way. One of the things that I felt very lucky at Microsoft and also at GoDaddy, and maybe in software in general, is that it always has been a little bit of a place where gender didn't matter so much. That is, my opinion. One opinion was pretty much as good as another, and I felt like in any discussion, I was able to get my point across as well as somebody else. And so in that way, I think maybe tech, or at least tech at a company like Microsoft or Google, is a lot like what the younger generations, we were early indicators of what future generations came to be. I'd say the difficult thing is, I would say at any level, conversations were like that. And the thing that I struggled with was getting into the conversations at the more senior level. I definitely felt like my promotion velocity was slower than some of my male colleagues. So I could get into the conversation, I could land a point. But when they looked for, who looked like the next guy who should lead the team, it was the next guy. And that pattern matching around what leaders looked like was really strong, and I think really limiting. And it actually takes a bunch of intentional work to unlearn sort of that pattern matching of what leaders look like to be able to expand diversity in leadership roles. And so I think that is changing more and more. And I think it's still hard, and a lot of women face those challenges. So even those under 30 women who are coming into the workplace are likely to face some of those challenges as they become more senior.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the value of strategic thinking, and how Armand, your CEO, led your workshop and your planning phase in examining that. So our students take a strategy class, and I wonder if you could share with them just why that is so valuable. You mentioned its value to you, but maybe expand that a bit. Why in thinking strategically is so valuable to the organization, and also, and as one, whether it's male or female, looking for a position coming out of an MBA program, how do you present yourself in an interview that demonstrates your ability to think strategically?
I'm actually going to do this a little bit with a story back from my office days. And, I actually always thought of myself as sort of a strategic person, a strategic thinker. And I said something like that around Stephen Sinofsky back in the early days. And Stephen used to say, like, I don't need more strategy people. I need people who can execute. And, again, that was part of my pattern of why in those early days, I thought Stephen didn't make, like he was working in a strange way. What I came to understand is an organization needs exactly one strategy. Like, you really need strategy is about figuring out how broadly you're going to go about attacking the goal that you have. And, if your goal is to be the biggest software vendor on the planet, or, the biggest, the store where everybody buys their things, there's 1,000 different paths to get there. And if you have a lot of leaders in the organization who each have a great strategy for it, you have 1,000 different motions competing with each other, and often doing more harm than good. And so the key to strategy is being able to understand it, being able to articulate it, and being able to really share it so that everybody can be enrolled in the same strategy. And that doesn't mean that you can't contribute, whether you're an individual contributor in an organization or a senior leader, that you can't contribute towards forming that strategy. But I think that the key is, strategy is powerful as an alignment tool, as a way where we all know how decisions are going to get made and to what end. And in that world, it's important that we have a shared strategy. So does that answer your question?
Yes, but then the second half, and that is, as our students are completing their degree and going out, finding employment, how can they enter the interview in a way that expresses their understanding and impression of how strategic thinking is so valuable?
Yeah. Okay. So what not to do is come in and say how strategic you are. What you should do is ask about the strategy. It is incredibly important for you to figure out if it's the right company, to understand the strategy, and to understand if a leader can articulate the strategy. But that conversation, your interest in learning about the strategy and understanding that, knowing that understanding the strategy will be incredibly important to contribute to your success, that conversation where you ask questions, understand it, brainstorm the implications of that will show strategic thinking. And so come in and not to show off what you know, but to see what you can learn.
Great. All right, another question comes up. As a rhetoric major in undergrad, I'm interested in how that degree helped to lead itself to your career success.
Yeah. I think it's come into play in a couple of ways. I mean, one, rhetoric is focused on how people come to understand information. It's not about what's true. It's about what is understood to be true. And so just in terms of communication and clearly articulating the underlying reasons and, being able to lay out your thinking has been just an important communication tool. But separate from that, one of the things in rhetoric is coming to understand those beliefs that are held below the arguments that you're making. And so, if you and I are having a disagreement, if you and I are sort of on opposite sides of things, it's not just because and you can see this play out in my journey in office. It's not just because I'm right and you're wrong. I don't say it's the other way around because, but it's probably because there's some things that we disagree about in terms of not just the facts, but what we think is important. And so what rhetoric has you do is sort of peel back, why is it that you think that? What are the beliefs that are underneath those things? And when you start to talk about why, if I start to get interested in why you think you're right, one, I might learn something, and I might actually find out that if I look at it from your perspective, you might actually be right. But sometimes just me inquiring and being interested might help reveal my thinking in a way that might bring you around. And I think as a leader, being able to work through problems and get to the bottom of an argument and being able to look at something from a different perspective rather than holding on to a truth too hard has been helpful for me. And I will say my rhetoric experience and coming at it through the perspective of argument instead of truth has been pretty useful, surprisingly useful.
So we have a question from one of our faculty. Lauren, thank you for sharing your experience. Is GoDaddy intentionally about developing women to advance to senior levels of leadership? And this another half of the question, do women enter the company knowing the company is committed to developing leaders, both men and women?
So when I came into GoDaddy, one of the reasons I came to GoDaddy was somebody who has often spoken in my father's classes. A guy named Blake Irving was then the CEO, and when he came into GoDaddy, he actually made women in leadership one of the things that he wanted to focus the culture around. It was something that he wanted to really promote. And it turns out that despite some weird commercials back in the day, that GoDaddy was actually always a pretty good place for women to work. But we hadn't been intentional about it. And when Blake came in, he made it part of the strategy as we were really pivoting from a marketing centric company to a more tech and customer centric company. And he had us work with some organizations like the Clayman Institute that do research on unconscious bias. And we actually did some mind-blowing work that I wouldn't say it was focused on leadership development, but it was focused on understanding bias and interrupting those biases. And so I'll tell a quick story about it. One of the projects that we did is we brought in this organization, the Clayman Institute, it's part of Stanford, and we had them sit in our VP performance calibration. This is where we're basically deciding what reviews our VPs are going to get. And they audited our conversation. So as the executive team was talking about the VPs, they just took notes on the language we used, on the words that we used. And then afterwards, they sort of explained to us what they heard. And, GoDaddy was a pretty nice place. It wasn't a hostile place. Women were well treated. But they said, when you talked about the men, you talked about their accomplishments and what they did. When you talked about the women, you talked about how they worked. You talked about their relationships with other people and how they were seen and how they got along. And the fact that you're talking about them different seems to correlate with the fact that men are getting better reviews. And so we said, okay, we want to fix that. So what do we do about it? And we worked together with them to come up with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is, if we really make it required that in those conversations, for every person, man and woman, that we talk about what they accomplished and we talk about how they worked. So we had to force ourselves for both genders to talk about both things. Maybe that would change the outcome. And we had auditors in the room who would intervene if somebody didn't talk about one or the other. And we went through this process and we went through a review cycle. It was nothing where it was about, doing something different for men or women. It was about talking about what and how for men and women. And in that very first year, and it's continued every year since, we completely normalized the disparity in promotions. Like it was phenomenal. It's like the best result that you could imagine. So that was like super exciting. But that's an example of the type of thing that we did at GoDaddy. We've done with GoDaddy around gender. It's not so much around leadership development, but I think it's at least as important.
Great, thank you. I'd be interested in exploring at the time, the very challenging times from multiple perspectives, right? What's the biggest challenge GoDaddy is facing now?
So this is like a huge period of change, and the world is changing dramatically. Surprisingly, to many people, this time of the pandemic where businesses are under a time of challenge, it's actually a growth period for us. While many businesses are shutting down, the people at those businesses have to figure out what their next gig is. And the internet is a great tool to do that. And so all of the people in sort of the online presence space in this, who build websites and things like that are seeing a lot of growth. So that, navigating those changes is somewhat of a challenge. But I think for us, the biggest challenge is that, GoDaddy historically is known for being a very predictable company anchored on domains. It was sort of like, it was a company that was born in a time when there was less change. And now we are needing to take bigger risks. We're needing to make more change in the way that we work. And we have to navigate that change with our investors, with our internal teams. And so, adapting to the opportunity that's there in the marketplace is sort of one set of challenge, but then figuring out how you change the culture and sort of reposition yourself to the outside world in order to meet the demands and the opportunities in those changes is exciting. It's super exciting.
Yes. So you mentioned the word risk. So what are some of the risks GoDaddy is now taking?
I think there's not one specific risk. One thing that we're doing that's risky. I think we used to, when we had an idea about something that was important, we used to really spend a lot of time saying, how do we know for sure that that's going to work out? I'll give one example is the product that I helped to make at GoDaddy is a product called Websites Plus Marketing, and it is available as a freemium product. Freemium means that you can go get a product, you can use it free forever, and then if you want to use certain capabilities, then you would pay and become a paying customer. And we actually saw that some of our competitors were doing this 5 years ago. Wix in particular was doing this. And we saw how useful that was as a lever, as a growth lever for that business. But we were very worried that as we moved in the direction of free, that it would cannibalize our sales. And so we did manage over the last 5 years to get from a fully paid product to a freemium product. But we did it in ways where we were measuring very carefully along the way to make sure that we didn't lose any revenue, like to make sure that, our conversion flows in the way that we did things sort of held the business level. And that's good because, on the one hand, we didn't screw up the business. On the other hand, it took us a lot of years. And I think the difference in how we're thinking about things now is we would say, how do we bound the risk? But how do we move quickly to prove out whether or not this works? So we'd probably take more, we'd go faster and then find ways to say, if it's not working, how do we dial back, rather than saying, how do we know for sure? Because I think we won't know for sure. One of the things that really, it started before Aman came in, and it really has become more and more important with Aman being there, is this focus on experimentation. You can't know. If you have to know and you're going to wait till you know, you will never do anything. So this focus on experimentation as a way to say, well, we don't know, we have a hypothesis. How do we design a test that won't break the business, that allows us to learn and find out in a fast way? And so that's say how we're approaching risk differently.
Great. Okay, so a couple more questions in the chat box. Lauren, as many industries are transitioning into a mobile presence, meaning more competition, how can GoDaddy provide a competitive advantage to a new entrepreneur?
Yeah. So I love that you brought up mobile, and it's been a fascinating journey for me. So I was in office back in the I was probably 90s when we started to notice that mobile was a trend, at least early 2000s, where like mobile was definitely a trend. And every year we would look at it and we would say, well, we see that this thing's becoming important, but it's not what our customers need now. And it wasn't until sort of the G Suites came out and started to do things in a simpler, faster mobile way that we realized that we started way too late, that we started, once customers actually were already doing it every day. And so when I came into GoDaddy, I had this experience of sort of seeing it and not acting on it fast enough. And so one of the things that we said early on in creating the products that we're now building is we have to design mobile first. And so we have taken this perspective of orienting ourselves to make sure that the things that we build for our customers work on mobile. And then more importantly, the experiences that our customers, the websites, for instance, that our customers are making for their customers, that they're designed for a mobile environment. But I would say that's sort of like the baseline mobile experience. That's not the competitive, that's the survival level of mobile experiences. The thing that we're doing now is saying, like, what is different in the world that is now becoming mobile first. And that led us to buy a company. We did an acquisition earlier this year, the very beginning of this year, of a company called Over. And Over is a native mobile content creation tool. It's what Adobe would have been had Adobe been created in the world of mobile. And so we're looking now at really the way that people work and where they're spending their time and the things they need to do, and bringing new applications, both organically and inorganically, to the front that are designed maybe for people that will never have a website, but are participating in the same kind of activities of promoting their business and driving their sales and driving their outcomes, but in wholly different means.
Great. Okay, I have a question for one of your customers.
Okay. Is
Um,
it a tech question?
I have 4 websites with GoDaddy for various business and hobbies of mine. Does GoDaddy offer any ideas or training for customers like me?
Yeah. So we're starting to do a lot more from this. We're now just starting to do webinars. And so I'll say this one thing: go do a search on YouTube, look for, GoDaddy and whatever the topics it is that you're interested in. See what's there and give me your feedback. You can reach me at Lauren A, Laurena, at GoDaddy.com. Mark, you can type that in the chat window if you want, if people want that. And tell me if you find things that you are finding valuable. And if you don't find them, tell me what you would like to see. So we are starting these both as webinars and as online trainers. And we're early in that journey. I think one of the strengths that GoDaddy has had is we consider ourselves guides. People call us, and we've always had sort of free phone service with really, really great technical support. And so we've always thought of ourselves as guides, but it took us longer to really think about, like, hey, we need more formal training and things that are available that people can use to go deeper, not just in how to use the tools, but how to make their business successful using tools. So we're starting to do that, and I'd love your feedback.
Great. So I have another question from another customer. And he says, I've been a GoDaddy client for my consulting business. This is one of our faculty. For my consulting business off and on for 7 or more years. Today, our customer service / experience is exceptional. How did GoDaddy achieve this level of quality that's consistent in sales and technical support?
Yeah. Trial and error comes to mind. I mean, I think one of the things is really believing that your customer and your relationship with the customer is the most important thing. I mentioned that when Aman came in, we realigned our organization, and we realigned it to align with the different customers that we serve. And that's been in the spirit, I think, of how GoDaddy has always behaved, with the customer at the center, and now we're organized in that way. But the journey in our customer care center, I think, has been one of saying we know that our relationship with the customer is our secret sauce. It was our differentiator before we had any other differentiators. And looking at what's working and what's not, we've invented a whole bunch of new systems to try to make sure that the people answering the phones have the right training and tools to be able to approach our customers in the way that we want them to do that. And sometimes we try things and they work great, and sometimes we try things and they don't work well, and we just keep trying and iterating and pushing to meet that customer expectation.
So let me pick up a couple things. We have another couple minutes, so let me jump in. Given the pandemic that we're dealing with now, what has changed in terms of the needs and the requests from your small business clients?
Yeah, 2 big changes. One is just the balance between the number of people running businesses and the number of people starting businesses has shifted, so that there are many more new starts who need help getting off the ground. So that's one area. And then the most dramatic thing is the shift from just being online to doing online commerce. When people can't transact in person, they need to transact online. And that's not just people who are selling things. That's people who are service providers, people who are teaching classes, people who run gyms are trying to figure out, if people can't come to my gym, what's the service that I can offer where I can get them online and do training in their home. And that transformation really comes with a whole bunch of needs and requirements. We've had to add features like integrating scheduling of appointments in with our commerce experiences. We've had to deal with things like local pickup, which wasn't really a feature we cared about before, and now it's common. So there's a lot of little things, but I think in general, just more business starts and a lot more online commerce.
Okay, final question. What's the future of GoDaddy look like?
It's pretty exciting. We are we've been going through this large strategy exercise and have now a 3-year strategy. And we are just building our first year budgets for that strategy. And we have an earnings call today where I imagine I think it's today, it's probably right now, where our CEO will talk a little bit about where we're investing toward growth. And when I say growth, in part, I mean GoDaddy growing, but specifically, I mean actually helping our customers grow their businesses. And so we talked about, if you think about GoDaddy 10 years ago, where we were mostly a utility provider, you came and got your domain from us, and then you went on to run your business. Now we're really working in partnership with our customers as they are starting their business, as they're coming online, as they're figuring out how they're going to sell their products and services. And so helping our customers grow is the next wave of GoDaddy.
Okay, all right. So, Lauren, thank you very much for joining us. Before we end, any final pearls of wisdom again for our students who are going to be, having a graduate degree, and what would you say for their next step? What's out there?
I always say find something that interests you and then just pursue it. And a lot of times I've heard students sort of worry that they're going to take the wrong step. And I will just say there's no wrong steps. I talked about some of my growth stories, and it wasn't getting bought by Microsoft and doing that job in the first couple of years that helped me grow. It was actually losing that first job, and that was the biggest growth opportunity. And so go in, do anything that is interesting to you, and don't worry about whether it's right or wrong, because either you will love it and that will be great, or you won't and you will learn something from it. And so it is a journey. You will have many runs. Take the risks and just go do it.
Great. All right, Lauren, thank you very much. I found your perspectives interesting. Of course, being your father, I'm a bit biased, right? But so if, again, anyone wishes to contact Lauren, her email is laurena@godaddy.com. And again, thank you very much. And again, I appreciate the audience for your questions and for the insight of your questions. They were very helpful. Okay.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure talking with you.